Welcome to The Big Decision. Today we're going to focus on what makes a good decision. This podcast originated because I have spent most of my professional life sitting with people at moments where decisions genuinely matter. These decisions have real consequences for people, for organisations, reputations, livelihoods, and sometimes futures. One of the things I've learned repeatedly is that we are remarkably bad at defining what a good decision actually is. We talk a lot about outcomes. We talk about results. We talk about KPIs. We talk about speed and confidence and decisiveness. We praise those leaders who make the call, but we criticise those who hesitate. And we rarely stop to examine whether the way that we are judging decisions is actually fundamentally flawed. Outcomes are seductive. They give us something tangible and something concrete to point to. If things work, we assume the decision was sound. If there are problems, we blame the bad decision or the decision maker. But that collapses very quickly when you spend time inside complex systems with many moving parts. I've worked with organisations where a single decision delivered strong short-term results but quietly created long-term damage. And this wasn't attributed to the flawed decision until much, much later. There's often a real resistance in corporate culture to lessons learned and cost of failure reporting. I've worked with leaders who made careful and principled decisions that were criticised at the time. And in those cases, those decisions were eventually recognised years later as being exactly the right call. So we can see that we have a lot of variability in how we assess what a good decision makes. The problem isn't that outcomes don't matter. Of course they do. The problem is when we use fast outcomes as the sole or primary measure of a decision's quality. A decision isn't made in hindsight. It's made in the moment with a specific set of often imperfect information under time constraints and under commercial pressures. If we want better decisions, and consequently we want better and sustainable results, we have to get much more honest about what is happening in the moments when the decision is made. Let me give you an example. Some years ago, I worked with a senior leadership team in a large organisation, as many of us do, facing the usual significant cost reduction programme. The numbers were stark and there was real pressure from the board to deliver savings. Timelines were tight, expectations were clear, the savings had to be found and they had to be found quickly. And on paper, solutions seemed obvious. Restructures that remove a layer of management, deliver required savings, deliver savings on pension and further obligations, and that would begin to produce relief almost immediately. And it looked clean, and it looked defensible, and it looked decisive, and it looked efficient. Most of the people around the table were in complete agreement that this was the right thing to do. It fit the narrative. At the time, the trend was for trimming the middle management layer. One leader in that room hesitated, and it wasn't because they didn't understand the numbers. It was because they understood the organisation. They knew exactly where informal leadership sat. They knew who held the knowledge that wasn't yet documented, and they knew which teams relied on the informal relationships. And this was experience that didn't show up neatly on an org chart. They asked slower, precise, and more considered questions. What capability would we lose? Where would decision-making bottlenecks appear? What would happen 6 months after the restructure when the immediate savings had been swallowed but the workload had not reduced? That leader was criticised in that moment for slowing things down. The pressure was intense, And there were so many comments about being overly cautious, about not being commercial enough, about resisting change, all of the usual things. In the end, a slightly modified approach was taken. It delivered a little bit less in terms of immediate savings, but importantly, following from the risk identified, it preserved the critical capabilities and the ability of the organisation to function and serve customers effectively. And a year later, when comparable organisations were struggling to rehire those people lost in the coals and firefighting the operational issues that flowed from those original decisions to cut staff and become leaner, dealing with the trust gap with the people remaining and following those huge layoffs, that organisation managed to remain stable and successful. So if you were to judge that decision purely on speed or short-term savings, it would have looked inferior. And many decisions are made that way as CFOs become CEOs. And if you judged it in hindsight on outcomes, on preserving the knowledge, the culture of the organisation, and the quality of the understanding, the foresight of what the consequences would be of acting too hastily, I'd argue it was exemplary. And this is what I mean when I say we need to redefine what good actually means. A good decision is not one that produces a favourable outcome by chance. It is one that's made with integrity on the conditions that exist at the precise moment in time we're asked to make it. It's the decision where the person taking it understands clearly their role, their responsibility, and the likely consequences of different paths, even when those paths are uncomfortable. Nobody said leadership was easy, and leadership decisions are very rarely about choosing between right and wrong. It's simply not that simple. They are about choosing between things like different design options, different vendors, different partners, which initiatives to pursue, and different kinds of risk, different risk appetites. They involve trade-offs that can't be resolved simply on a spreadsheet. Many organisations still behave as though decisions should be absolutely obvious if only people were competent enough. And that belief creates a culture where leaders feel pressured to perform miracles of certainty rather than taking the space to practice judgment. Paradoxically, the consequence of this is risk-averse cultures when we profess that we want innovation and a loss of commercial upside and value capture. And I've seen this play out repeatedly at board level and in the results and the balance sheet. Boards ask for recommendations. The executive team knows the information is incomplete. The market is shifting. There's variables outside of everybody's control. Could be external market conditions, could be political events, could be access to talent and technology, could be myriad things. But the expectation in the room is certainty and that somebody knows the answer. So what happens is people oversimplify. They lose the nuance, and one person presents that single, clear and safe option, and people go with it. And it's not because the option is objectively higher quality or superior. It's simply easier to reach a consensus and move on to the next meeting because that feels safer than saying, this is complex, here's the risks. This is what else we need to either research and take time over or accept as risk. And that is not good decision making. That is complete risk avoidance, and it often costs opportunity or completeness in the solutions that then result. A good decision process makes uncertainty visible. It doesn't pretend uncertainty is not present. It names the assumptions and caveats clearly, and that was a practice that I embedded into commercial approvals in my corporate career, and it works. It acknowledges that there are trade-offs and there are alternatives. It makes explicit who or what departments carry which risks in which scenario, and it identifies for action the right mitigation strategies. This is uncomfortable and detailed work, and those that flag risk can be branded as naysayers or of stalling progress. And nobody wants that for themselves, but it is necessary. Good decision-making requires integrity, it requires maturity, and it requires stewardship. It requires comfort with ambiguity and an organisational culture that values judgment over speed and those performance theatrics. One of the most persistent myths that I encounter is that good decision makers are simply decisive people. Some people argue that decisiveness is a personality trait and that hesitation is a weakness. Hesitation and requests for clarity are often qualifiers that judgment is happening. In reality, the strongest decision makers that I've observed and that I know are often the most quiet and the most thoughtful people. They're not the loudest voices in the room, and they're willing to pause. And it's not because they lack confidence or they're unsure of themselves, but it's instead because they reflect. They're deeply aware of consequence and impact. Good decision makers understand that speed amplifies whatever thinking is already present. And if the thinking quality is poor, speed makes it dangerous. I worked once with a founder who prided themselves on making those fast snap decisions, and it was very much part of their identity. Shoot from the hip, move quickly, trust your gut, and correct the course later. And that cavalier approach served them so well in the early stages of business, where courage is king. But as the organisation grew and matured, the cost of those fast decisions sometimes increased. Teams were destabilised, relationships were damaged, and trust became eroded. Strategic direction kept pivoting on a dime, and people became reluctant to commit emotionally to the goals because they didn't trust that the decisions would hold. They became tentative in execution because they didn't have belief in the quality of the decisions being made. With the founder themselves, when we unpacked this, it was clear the issue is not intelligence or ambition. This person was abundant in both. It was that the founder was still making decisions as though the organisation was small and that those decisions were reversible, when they were much more visible and the decisions now carried much higher risks and impact. The fast decision making was linked to their identity, and they felt they would be perceived negatively if they slowed down. And so many decisions are actually more negatively influenced by our own identity attachment and worrying what others may think than feeling into what is correct, what is measured. A good decision in that context requires a completely different approach. It requires more reflection. It requires more consultation and dialogue, more humility perhaps, and more responsibility for understanding and mapping impacts on stakeholders. And this is why I resist the idea that decision quality is rooted in personality. It is about context and capacity. People don't suddenly become poor decision makers. They become overtired, their environment changes, they're under too much pressure, and their decision conditions change with it. And this matters because when we misdiagnose the problem, we apply the wrong solutions. We send people on confidence training when what they really need is better and clearer governance. We push for speed when we need clarity. We reward certainty and a decision being made rather than rewarding judgment. So if we strip this back to the fundamentals, what makes a good decision? For me, a good decision is that's made with the information reasonably available at the time, not the imagined information that we wish we had, or the market conditions we wish existed, or vague assumptions. Data is what drives decisions. Decisions must be made with a clear understanding of our limitation of our own responsibility, and we shouldn't make them cautiously or outsource them to groupthink and consensus in an attempt to avoid blame. Decisions that engage honestly with consequences, including those consequences that may not be immediately visible, are those that stand the test of time. Most importantly, a good decision is a decision that can be stood behind without defensiveness, even if the outcome is later challenged. This doesn't mean rigidity. Good decision makers remain open to learning, reflection, and adjustment. There is a big difference between being open and being untethered and rash. So when leaders can't explain why a decision was made beyond it worked or it didn't, the learning stops. Everything becomes reactive. So as we move through this series, I want to encourage you to slow decision-making down just enough that we can see it properly and clearly. We don't want to make it difficult or overwrought, but what we do want is to make it robust. In the next episode, we're going to look at what happens to judgment under pressure, because even the most thoughtful decision makers can find their capacity quietly eroded when fear, urgency, and perceived loss enter the equation. Understanding that is essential if we want decisions that hold when outcomes really matter. Thank you for listening.